Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com, and today we're going to be reviewing a tricky spot from a $1,000 buy-in World Series of Poker event that I played recently. We are playing pretty early in the day. It's 150-300 with an ante, and it folds around to a probably tight aggressive player in the cutoff who raises to 725. And it gets around to move King 5 offsuit in the big blind. And in this scenario, I think we have two good options. We can either call because we are getting amazing pot odds, right? We have to put in 400 chips to try to win a pot that's going to be 2,000. So will we realize 20% equity in this pot? We definitely will. You pretty much always will under-realize your equity when you are out of position, just because you're going to be check folding the best hand sometimes, right? And whenever you make the best hand, sometimes you're going to end up folding it. But we're still going to realize 20% equity. We could also re-raise though. If we do re-raise as a bluff, because we have the king blocker essentially, we're going to have some amount of fold equity, especially if our opponent will only continue with decently strong hands. Now, if our opponent is really tight, they may only be opening with very strong hands that are not folding to a 3-bet, so clearly you don't want to be bluffing people who are never folding. But for the most part, if our opponent's raising stuff like 7-5 suited and ace 8 offsuit and stuff like that from the cutoff, which, is not especially tight, but it's kind of normal, maybe even a little bit loose. If they are opening those hands, a re-raise to 2,400 will be quite strong and will put them in a pretty bad spot because they have to fold out a large chunk of their junky hands or run a giant bluff. And if they want to run a giant bluff, that's fine because I'm also going to be re-raising with my best hands in this scenario some portion of the time. So those are our options. If I do re-raise, I do want to make it big, like 2,400. Don't make it 1,700. That is a big mistake because if you make it 1,700, then your opponent has to put in 1,000 chips to win a 4,000 pot, which is clearly great for our opponent. So don't re-raise small from out of position. This time I did decide to call. We get bottom pair on 9-9-5, and some people always lead in this spot because we clearly have more 9s in our range. Also, we also have a lot of draws in our range, and our 5 doesn't really mind protection, right? Because if our opponent just has 2 overcards, then they're very, very live to improve to beat us. That said, I typically just don't do a whole lot of leading, but this is a candidate where leading does have some merit. I check, and the opponent bets 650, and now this is where I have been experimenting a bit. In general, on paired boards, the player in the big blind has many more trips than the player in the cutoff, assuming the paired card is medium or low. And that's because from the big blind, I'm defending with 9-6 suited, 9-7 offsuit, 9-8 offsuit, 10-9 offsuit, right? And our opponent may not be raising those hands. So I should have more 9s in general than our opponent. This is especially true if it was instead 9-5-5, right? Because then our opponent has almost no 5s, whereas I have many more 5s. So we don't necessarily have all of the trips here, and our opponent has none, right? That's not the case, but we probably have a few more in our range than our opponent. So in this scenario, the way it works out is our opponent's range has more equity than ours across the board, but the hands of ours that are good have way more equity than our opponent's range, which is going to happen 10 or 15% of the time. So in this scenario, I'm not exactly sure the right way to proceed. I think calling is probably the best play. But I also like raising, and I have been experimenting with raising in spots like this. If it was 8-8-5, I would like the raise way more. On 9-9-5, it's a little bit dicey. On 10-5-5 or Jack-5-5, I would not like the raise because then our opponent has lots more of the good 10s than Jacks, right? So if I'm going to raise, you don't need to raise big because when we raise here, we're essentially saying I either have a 9 or I have a draw, right? And if I have a 9, our opponent's probably drawing dead or nearly dead. And if I have a draw, well, we have some outs. I'm also going to be raising here with lots of other stuff. This 5 should probably just fit in the calling range. But if I did have a hand like pocket 8s, it's also a reasonable hand to raise because we can get called by some worse stuff, right? So in this scenario, I do decide to raise small to 1,400, and it's dicey. Our opponent does call. And whenever you do raise small, your opponent will call a lot because notice your opponent has to call 700 more into a pot that's going to be 4,700. So clearly they're getting amazing odds, so they are going to call a lot. Now you may say, why do you want your opponent to call a lot when you have bottom pair? And that's because I'm not thinking about my exact bottom pair, I'm thinking about my whole range in general. And in general, whenever I do have a pair here, it's on average going to be good. It's going to on average be the best hand. And if our opponent does fold out hands like overcards, it's a great success, right? And if they do call with over pairs, realize we're not actually losing all that much. So our opponent does call, turns a 4 of hearts, which is an interesting card because our opponent very easily could just have a hand like Jack of Hearts 10 or something like pocket 3s with 3 of hearts. And these hands all have a decent amount of equity that I don't really mind protecting against. That said, we could just be dead. Our opponent could have a 9, our opponent could have a flush, our opponent could have an overpair with a heart, right? So it's pretty easy for me to also be in very bad shape. So in scenarios like that, where usually you're either way ahead or way behind for the most part, you usually want to check or bet small. And I think we can go either way here. If I do check, though, I think I'm probably supposed to fold if my opponent bets. And I think checking really invites a bet. Because if our opponent does have a hand like pocket 3s with the 3 of hearts, he may just decide, you know what, the guy is 8-7 and decided to give up, so I need to bet to protect against 8-7. And that would be a bit of a disaster, right? So I elect to bet small. I definitely like a small bet. You may say, should we just completely turn our hand into a bluff to try to get our opponent off of overpairs? I don't think that would be so bad, but you have to realize what you're trying to accomplish, right? Like right here, I'm trying to keep the pot small against hands that are, slightly behind mine or maybe slightly ahead of mine, whatever. Whereas if I bet bigger, I'm essentially betting turn to bet again on the river to try to get our opponent perhaps even off of a 9, right? Because a lot of the obvious draws did just come in. If I had a flush draw, I would bet big on the turn and I would jam the river. So this is a scenario where I'm definitely betting with 9s and 5s and maybe the underpairs. And if I was going to be polarizing my range, I'd be betting with probably more hands like 8-7 offsuit or maybe 8-7 with the 8 of hearts and then also some flushes or full houses. So we'll have 2 different strategies here. Where with one strategy we're betting big with a very polarized range and another strategy where we're betting smaller with a more linear range. And this is the more linear range, right? Condensed range, right? Not the best hands, not the worst hands, the medium strength hands. So our opponent does call, as expected, because again, they're getting pretty good odds. Now on the river, what do we do? As I see it, when the river's the ace of diamonds, I think we have 2 options. We can either check to check fold, because if our opponent did have like ace of hearts, he's going to call the flop raise, he's going to call the turn bet, and, well, here we are. We lose. Or I can bet very big to try to get my opponent to fold an ace. Now, some people don't mind folding top pair. Some people will never fold top pair. If your opponent will never fold top pair, that's a horrible strategy. If your opponent will often fold top pair, then that's a pretty sweet strategy, right? So we really can go either way in this situation. In general, though, I think checking's probably just best. If our opponent does have a junky hand like king high, he may not even bluff with it, which is clearly great. So in this spot, I think the right play is going to be to check because I can still win at showdown some portion of the time. And you may say, like, obviously you never win at showdown, which, yes, I agree, we don't win a showdown very often. And for that reason, bluffing is a consideration. The problem, though, is it's so easy for the opponent to have a 9 or a flush or an ace that the range I'm trying to bluff them off of is pretty strong. So for that reason, I think I just need to check. I do check, opponent checks, and we lose to 9-7 of clubs. So you may say, clearly this hand went horribly. Your opponent had the trips, and you just lost a bunch of money. Let's go back and think, what would have happened if I check, call, flop, check, call, turn, check, river? Notice if I check, call, flop, we lose a little bit less. On the turn, our opponent's probably going to bet again. I mean, I would have to assume the opponent's going to bet again with 3 9s here. Checking would be fine, but probably not ideal. So we're going to lose probably, 2,500 chips, 2,000 chips, because I don't think we can just check fold here because this is a pretty great bluff card for our opponent because they want to bet with queen of hearts, jack, right? And then on the river, I would have had to check fold. So we would have ended up losing like 500 chips less or 800 chips, or sorry, 500 or 800 chips more, depending on exactly how our opponent played it. But we don't get any protection playing in that manner. We let our opponent realize their equity very, very easily with all of their overcards. So even in this kind of bad scenario, it didn't actually work out too poorly because, yeah, we lost the pot, but we only lost a few hundred chips more than we normally would, which notice 800 chips is 2.5 or 3 big blinds. It's just not that big of a deal, especially if we can get protection by from the various overcards that have plenty of equity and also make it more difficult for our opponent to bluff us. Because imagine our opponent does have queen of hearts, jack. They're going to bet the flop, bet the turn, and bet the river if I check, call, flop, check, call, turn, because this is just a great run out to continue bluffing, and I end up losing those pots pretty much every time, whereas played in this way, all those marginal hands, I end up winning the pot or least having a pretty good shot of winning the pot instead. So, interesting hand. I'm not sure this is the best spot for the small check raise. I think I would like it a little bit more, like I said, if the paired card was a little bit lower. But we were experimenting, we tried it, and it didn't even work out that poorly given we were set up pretty hard, which is always nice. So that's going to be it for today. If you enjoyed this video for Poker News, please let them know. Also, follow me on Twitter, @JonathanLittle. There I have tons and tons of educational poker content that is completely free for you. I'm out here to help you improve your poker and your life, and if I can do that in some small way, then, well, we succeeded. Good luck in your games, have fun, and I'll talk to you next week.